the United States is we're pushing very hard to get Americans released. I think only one American has been released so far. So I think that there's another round of negotiations involving us to try to get the next round out. I just think in a couple of days, Hamas is going to run out of a ready supply of civilian hostages to release, and then I think you're likely to see a resumption of conflict. What I think the United States is doing in the interim is trying to persuade Israel to take a very different approach to the military campaign if and when it resumes, so that they've massively reduced the number of civilian casualties, because I don't think the U.S. thinks it's sustainable for casualty rates at this level to continue.
So there is some more positive news tonight with 12 more hostages who'd been held since October the 7th back in Israel.
Yeah, well, that's obviously a very positive development, and I know a lot of folks in the Biden administration and around the world have been working very hard to bring that to pass. I was part of negotiating a ceasefire with Hamas and Israel in 2014, which fell apart before it even began. So I know how difficult that is, what a tough road it was. And it sounds like even today they had some skirmishes on the ground that could have blown the whole thing up. So very positive it's lasted this far. I think we have another day. In terms of what's previously been agreed upon, another 10 hostages will get released. And then the big question becomes whether it gets extended out beyond that.
Yeah, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. But having been involved in these negotiations, or these types of negotiations, why do you think that this arrangement has managed to bring about releases on both sides, despite, as you say, there were some breaches of the agreement not to fight while this continues? There were some Israelis that came under fire. There's a blame game going on as to who was responsible. But yet the deal delivered more hostages. What do you think has been the key to this?
Well, I think the short answer is both sides wanted this ceasefire. Both sides benefit from it. Hamas never really wanted to keep all those civilian hostages anyway. They had an offer on the table, I think, a month ago to release most of these guys. So to them, it's really cost-free. It's a burden for them, in their mind anyway, to continue to hold all these, old elderly folks and women and children and that sort of thing. And the Israelis obviously are under a lot of pressure internally from the families of the hostages to get them released. And there's also an opportunity, I think, for humanitarian assistance to get in, and for Israel to come up with a plan for how it's going to prosecute the next stage of the war in a manner that doesn't involve so many civilian casualties. So short answer is both sides benefit, and that's why it's held so far.
Israel has been making it clear that it has not wavered from its objective of, as it puts it, destroying Hamas. What do you think is going to happen in another 24 hours or so when this agreed truce, as some have called it, a pause in the fighting, comes to an end?
Obviously difficult to say. My guess is that you may see another extension of a day or two. I think Hamas has more hostages that they're able to release. I know the United States is pushing very hard to get Americans released. I think only one American has been released so far. So I think that there's another round of negotiations involving us to try to get the next round out. I just think in a couple of days, Hamas is going to run out of a ready supply of civilian hostages to release, and then I think you're likely to see a resumption of conflict. What I think the United States is doing in the interim is trying to persuade Israel to take a very different approach to the military campaign if and when it resumes, so that they've massively reduced the number of civilian casualties, because I don't think the U.S. thinks it's sustainable for casualty rates at this level to continue.
But the difficulty, as both sides have been pointing out, is that Hamas fighters are pretty deeply embedded amongst the civilian population. Presumably, in these last few days, those Hamas fighters will have had an opportunity to regroup, perhaps to make sure that they are more hidden away, or perhaps, as we've seen in the past, close to hospitals and so on. It's going to be very difficult, isn't it, for Israel to reach that objective of destroying Hamas, killing more of its fighters, without many more civilian casualties.
You're exactly right. And in my mind anyway, that's the most pressing question of all, is what is Israel's plan militarily here? Because if you have 25 to 35,000 Hamas militants, which is the estimate at the beginning of the war, and by Israel's own account, it's killed maybe 4,000 or 5,000 of them, and a lot of the rest of them are hidden underground and they're embedded with the civilian population. How exactly is Israel going to go about getting thousands of Hamas fighters out of tunnels that go hundreds of feet underground that also have hostages in them. So I think that's a question a lot of folks have right
So
now.
just to pick
What
you
is the
up on
exit?
that, because there was a slight breakup on the line, you think there were at the beginning of this conflict some 25 to 35,000 Hamas fighters there in Gaza?
Yes, that's correct. Those are public estimates, 25 to 35,000. And what I've seen from the Israeli side, anyways, they think they've maybe killed 5,000 of them, give or take. So whatever the math is, it's maybe a fifth of the Hamas fighters are have been killed, and meaning that 80% of them are still out there. And how you even go about trying to get them out of those tunnels when they're hostages down there, it's a very, very vexing question for the Israelis and honestly for the United States as well.
And do you think that Israel will come under much more intense pressure from the US, its key allies, and from others as well, to try to find a way to bring this fighting not just to a temporary pause, but to an end, to try to seek some kind of accommodation, negotiated end to this?
Well, I think that there's already a lot of pressure from around the world. I think the real question for the Israelis is how much pressure are they getting from the United States? And I think what we've focused on right now is not an end to the fighting altogether, but a much more targeted approach to the military campaign that allows for civilians to be gotten out of harm's way and allows for a massive amount of humanitarian assistance to go in. And that is really the crux of it right now. There's a humanitarian catastrophe building in Gaza. There already is one. But now you're talking about 1 million displaced people in southern Gaza who have no food, no water, no shelter, no fuel. And so that is, I think, a looming problem that we're really pushing the Israelis to deal with, in addition to tailoring their military campaign to reduce civilian casualties as much as they possibly can.
And just finally, I mean, how difficult is it to even foresee some kind of future talks, negotiations going on when you have got this very hardline Israeli government under Benjamin Netanyahu, whose own position is in jeopardy? You have this splintered Palestinian leadership, and you can only assume that much of the population, or many amongst the population in Gaza as well as the West Bank, may have been further radicalized by what's happened.
You're 100% right. And we did negotiations in 2014, direct negotiations between the Israelis and the Palestinians, in a very, very different context, and they didn't really go anywhere. So it's difficult for me to imagine how you're going to get the parties back to any kind of serious peace talks on a two-state solution anytime in the foreseeable future. And I mean at least the next year or so. And that's assuming that Hamas is out of the picture, right? Because if they're still fighting an insurgency in Gaza for the next 2 years, which is also not out of the question, then you don't even have the opportunity to have a conversation about what a peace process would look like. So, the very, 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 very challenging set of circumstances for the Israelis, for the United States, and of course for the people of Gaza and of Israel. It's a real tough one.
Frank Lowenstein, former US Special Envoy for Israeli-Palestinian negotiations when we had them. Really good to have you with us tonight. Thank you so much.
Thanks.